So this morning, I'm happy to say that Reverend Jushin Stephyn Butcher is our speaker. He started his Buddhist journey in 1997, practicing in the Tibetan tradition under His Holiness Penor Rinpoche. Several dharma names later, he found his way to Hokyoji, where he became a student of Dokai Georgesen. Jushin, which means abiding trust, received jukai from Dokai in 2013 and ordination in 2017. He works as a software engineer by day, teaches artificial intelligence at Johns Hopkins University by night, and resides in Cambridge, Maryland, with his husband, dog, chickens, and garden. Having introduced this very interesting person, take it away, Jushin.
Good morning, everyone. I think if I had paid attention to the different calendars, I might have picked a different topic today, seeing as there's people at Hokyoji. I feel like I need to explain the joke about dharma names, though. In the Tibetan tradition in Tibet, they actually believe in causes and conditions to such a degree that they will often change their name if they're having a run of bad luck or an illness. So to them, their name is just another cause and condition. And if they're having bad luck, they need to change their name to change their luck or to get better. So they very often change their name. And it's very often the case that they will give the equivalent of jukai that we do over and over again. And they just give you a new dharma name. So that was like, so if you're in the Tibetan tradition for any length of time, you just get new dharma names over and over and over and over again. So that's why I tell that joke, but probably nobody in the Zen circles gets it. So good morning. I am, as Kyoku said, Jushin Stephyn Butcher, and I'm coming to you from Cambridge, Maryland. My talk this morning is on the 12 links of dependent origination, sort of then and now. So when I spoke, I'm trying to figure out how this is working. I originally picked every other month, but it's not actually working out that way. So it may have been the beginning of last month that I spoke last. I was talking about, there's a line in the 8 realizations of Mahasattvas, of great beings. In the first realization, it says that the first realization is the awareness that the world is impermanent. All political regimes are subject to fall. All things composed of the 4 elements are empty and contain the seeds of suffering. Human beings are composed of the 5 skandhas, or the aggregates, and are without a separate self. They're always in the process of change, constantly being born and constantly dying. They are empty of self, without sovereignty. So actually, it was that was a long lead up to the without sovereignty part. It's mostly what I talked about last time in terms of their not being a separate self or a not self. We all call it selflessness, a lot of different things in Buddhism in general. And so the basic implication being there's not probably free will the way we generally think of it. There's reactive behaviors, and we can be proactive, but at least free will, the way we think about it. There are no which sort of assumes uncaused causes, the idea of free will. So what I want to tackle a little bit today, both sort of in a Buddhist sense and sort of a modern understanding, is this idea of basically dependent origination. But here in the 8 realizations, they're talking about parts of it here. They talk a little bit about all things are composed of the 4 elements. That would be earth, air, water, and fire. Or today, what we would say is things are solid, gaseous, liquid, and energy. So we have a different conception of elements. We have like silicon and stuff like that, but what they identified as elements 2,500 years ago or so, was really kind of the four states of matter. And so they're always always in the process of change, constantly being born, constantly dying. And so that's sort of where the 10 links of dependent origination come in. And when I had in my idea that I would talk about the 10 links or the 12 links. Well, that's the problem. So in some systems there are 10 links, and some there are 12. I remember that someone asked about dependent origination once before. I think it was Dr. Winberg. And he was like, what is that? I'm like, oh gosh, don't make me rattle them off, because I know I'll never remember them. So I thought that I would talk about them today. But I also want to talk to them a little bit in maybe a different, Tim talked last year, Master Jack, about maps and different maps. And so we can think of the 10 links of dependent origination as a map. Map also being a model. George Bach said all models are wrong, but some are useful. So we want to see how useful maybe that the ancient Buddhist version of 10 links are, and sort of more of a model, more modern one. And this is coming out of Robert Sapolsky, who you might, he's not a Buddhist, and wouldn't even say these are anything about a dependent origination, but they caught my eye in something I was reading of his. He wrote Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, is a famous book of his. And so he's a great guy, researcher out of Stanford. So the 12 links are ignorance, formations, consciousness, name and form, the six sense spaces, contact, sensation, thirst, grasping, becoming, being born, old age, and death. And as I was preparing for this talk, as I started to say, I was very heartened to find out that there's no agreement on what these all are and how they all relate. There is some academic doubt as to whether these were actually even part of the original earliest Buddhist canon. And there's doubt about their current formulation as well. And there are different ways of interpreting. And so I guess the upshot of that is there's not a consistent understanding of them. There is a sort of understanding, like these are, so the 12 links are sort of what you would say the mainline causes and conditions of the main factors of dependent origination, but they're not the only ones. So when we say that ignorance causes formations, they're not a sufficient cause. Ignorance has to come in with other causes and conditions about which we don't know anything. There is a passage in the Pali Canon where the Buddha and Ananda are talking, and Ananda basically says, oh, I get it. Karma is just really easy. And the Buddha, as usual, says, no, Ananda, don't say that. That's not true. It's not that easy. It's very subtle. And he goes on to say that what's happening to us is not necessarily the result of karma, but it could be it's a very Eastern medicine view of things. Like it could be, what is it, phlegm in the airs. And so it could just be all kinds of different causes and conditions, not just karma. Although these days we do sort of tend to use karma as just sort of a catch-all phrase for causes and conditions. Originally in the Brahmanic tradition, karma was your intention when you made an offering. And the Buddha sort of hijacked that to be any intention for an intention for any action. So we start out. So there's that. The other thing is that these are often understood to be not, so we have to tell them in a linear order, describe them in a linear order, but they're often described as being co-dependent arisings, interdependent arisings. So you can think of you've seen stalks of corn all supporting each other. So if you take out one stalk of corn, they all fall down, but they're all supporting each other. And so you have to go through it linearly, but sometimes it doesn't make sense when you do that. And honestly, sometimes it doesn't make sense. And as I say, a song, I just decided to reorder them at one point when he was doing his commentary. So ignorance. So ignorance is basically ignorance of reality. It's ignorance of our actual situation. Concretely, it's generally specified as being ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, the three marks of existence, being what? Impermanence, non-self, and dukkha. In the Mahayana, we have four marks. We add emptiness. Everything's empty. So that's ignorance. That's not normally a sticking point or a hard one to get. But then we sort of move into formations. And then it starts to get a little weird. Formations is basically the idea that out of this ignorance, we develop habits and impulses. Steve Goodman, who has yet a different characterization of the 12 links, is basically these are our characteristics, our personality quirks. They're just like really deep. They're coming out of just habitual ways of sort of being and doing. So that's the formations. And then next we sort of go on to consciousness. And this is where it always feels like things get out of order. So consciousness in this sense is just sort of the I guess you could call it the field in which everything is going. It's typically the six consciousnesses. So there are regular thinking consciousness, eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose, taste, and touch consciousness. So if you remember the Heart Sutra, you have all the consciousnesses down. Consciousnesses, these give rise to name and form. So I sort of, again, like Steve Goodman's characterization of this is that we very quickly move from consciousness to imagination. So we just quickly are going on to naming things and very quickly giving form to things. One part, so there's different characterizations of the 12 links, especially in the Tibetan tradition. These are told, you have to tell them within the context of 3 successive lives. So some of the things happen in one life, and then they describe how it happens in the next life, and then how it happens in the next life. There's another version where this is just going on all the time. 12 links of dependent origination is just a description of our experience in life. And sort of another aspect of this is the 12 links is not something that happens to you. It is something that is, it's your experience. You and your experience are happening within the 12 links. Maybe in Zen, we might say that there's nothing outside of the way. There's nothing outside of this. So it's not something that's happening to you. It is actually the enclosing vessel of your experience. All right. So I'm talking more about the moment-to-moment version of the 12 links than, say, the different lives version. So we have consciousness, and then that consciousness, whether it is sight or hearing or touching, just quickly starts assigning names to things and quickly starts creating forms around those perceptions. From that, we get to the actual 6 sense bases, which are then the eye base, the ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. The commentary that I'm reading is from Ajahn Suchito, And he doesn't have much to say about this one. It's basically a movement of consciousness to awareness at the six different levels, at the six different spheres, sense spheres. This is actually a really big thing that shows up again and again in the Pali Canon. In the Sabha Sutta, the Buddha, it's called the all. The Buddha basically says the all is what appears in these six sense spheres. Basically, it's what we see, what we hear, taste, touch, and cognize. That's basically the all. And if you, he says literally, if you were to posit anything else, that you couldn't really demonstrate its existence. So the six sense bases are really important in the Pali Canon. Also in the Baha'ya Sutra, the Buddha talks about the six sense bases as being an entry into liberation. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So we're still on our links. So from the six sense bases, and we have contact. So it's the contact of the seer, seeing, and the seen. All of these have images. This particular image is one of lovers. It says consorting. So they're embraced. And this is just the immediacy, the unseparatedness of the perceiving, the perceiver and the perceived. We have slightly different ways of thinking about it, I think, later in Zen, but in this, there's still a perceiver, perceiving, perceived. And then we move on to that to sensation. And this is where it stops getting sort of abstract here, which is why I think a song a reordered thing. So sensation is, I always think of it like we're walking around and it's like maybe a Star Trek heads up display. And we have our six sense bases, we have thoughts, we have opinions, we have, there's hearing, there's seeing, there's tasting. And immediately it's, I like that, I don't like that, I like that, I don't like that, I don't care about that, I like that, I don't like that. And it's like everything's circled in red and green. It's just meaning like everything around us, constantly everything about our experience is immediately pleasant, unpleasant, or unpleasant, which we just tend to completely ignore. And the next stop is thirst. So once we have identified all these sensations as pleasant and unpleasant and neutral, then we want the pleasant ones and we don't want the unpleasant ones. So, so this is often, this is Trishna in Pali, Tana in Sanskrit, and thirst in English. So this is the wanting of something then that is pleasant, or the not wanting of something that is unpleasant. And then the next step is grasping. So normally we talk about attachment. So that's normally associated with the fulfillment of thirst. And so, so you might have a craving for something, but until it's actually realized, so you either avoid the unpleasant thing or you get the pleasant thing, that's actually when attachment starts. You're attached to avoiding the unpleasant. You're attached to having the pleasant. And so that's grasping, that's upadana. And then the next step is becoming. So with becoming, with that attachment, that becomes sort of a momentum that propels you into your next experience or your next situation. So this is kind of this step is sort of almost a motor force that's the attachment becomes a motor force that sort of moves the link around. And let's see. And then it becomes, and then you have becoming, being born, new experiences, old experience drop away, you have death finally for the last link. And then because we are in ignorance, it starts all over again. So those are the 12 links as generally understood. As I mentioned, there are inconsistencies in the sutras. In some places there are 10, in some places there are 12. There are different ways of understanding them. In terms of awakening, any one of those, like, so you only have to break the chain in any of those places to stop the cycle. And there are different, it's sort of interesting. So I mentioned the sense doors in the six sense bases. In the Bahia Sutra, the Buddha actually says, actually uses that as one of the sense doors. He says to Bahia, Bahia is chasing the Buddha around. The Buddha's trying to do alms. He's trying to shoo him off, saying, "Hey, I don't teach during alms. Come back to me later." And Bahia is saying, "Yeah, something bad might happen to me. It might happen to me," and like you have to cue the ominous sounds because something bad does happen to him later in the sutra. But he says, "Teach me," and the Buddha basically says, "Okay." And he says, "Then Bahia, you should train yourself thus. In reference to the seen, there will only be the seen. In reference to the heard, only the heard. In reference to the sensed, only the sensed. In reference to the cognized, only the cognized. That is how you should train yourself. When for you, there will only be the seen in reference to the seen, only the heard in reference to the heard, only the sensed in reference to the sensed, only the cognized in reference to the cognized, then Bahia, there is no you in connection with that. When there is no you in connection with that, there is no you there. When there is no you there, you are neither here nor yonder nor between the two. This, just this, is the end of dukkha. So that's one way. And then in the Satipatthana, I think it's in the Satipatthana Sutra, the Buddha goes on and he talks about, basically that one is the teaching of the mindfulness of breath, but he also talks about how other people are getting realization through boundless friendliness and other practices. So there are lots of different ways into the 12 links of dependent origination. And there's a lot of interesting stuff here, some of which I have touched upon in other topics. It's a really common theme in the Pali Canon, Tibetan tradition, I think even today and sort of like every day, that we are passive seers of the world. Like, the image I said earlier, there were images. So the image for the six sense spaces is a house with 6 windows and stuff just comes in. But we know this isn't the truth. This isn't how it actually happens. We are not, in the Tibetan tradition, they speak of being a mirror. So we just reflect the world. You know, we have our pristine conscious awareness, and then we're just reflecting. And or I think commonly we think of we're like lenses, like there's some little person back behind our eyes, looking out of our eyes or lenses, and just light comes in. That isn't at all what happens. In fact, our brain is actively making patterns. That's what our brains, that part of our brains do. They're actively making patterns. And in fact, it is the senses that keep the brain in line. So we are actually very active in our perception. but not consciously active. It's just our brain is, we are, as Seth and Neil puts it, we are hallucinating reality. And it is the senses that sort of keep everything in line, which is why generally hallucinations are always about things being there that aren't, not things not being there that are, because that one wouldn't work for very long if you were hallucinating that cars didn't exist and you ran out in traffic. So that part is, it's kind of interesting in terms of it fits very much well in with dependent origination, but it's sort of a mistaken view of what's going on and how perception works. But sort of the other way I sort of want to sort of think about things today, and again, this goes back to Tim's talks about maps, is sort of the more current way of thinking about causes and conditions. And Robert Sapolsky, he's the researcher at Stanford. He describes a scenario. It'd be great if the Polycanon had done something similar, and then we could have compared them. But he has a scenario. There's a crisis situation. You have a gun. Somebody's running towards you. They're armed, and you fire the gun. And what he wants to know is what led to you firing the gun. And so he tells the story of, and even says multiple levels of causality. So in the second you fire the gun, everything is mostly up to the amygdala. The amygdala is in your brain. Here, it's a module in your brain. It's basically processing fear and violence. And speaking of senses, so we tend to think of the six sense spaces. We see things, and then maybe consciously or unconsciously we perceive things, and that causes our actions. What's actually happening is we see something. It's going to higher level brain functions and being processed, and it is relatively slow, but that impulse is also going directly to the amygdala. And depending on the activation of your amygdala at that point, you may react faster than the higher level processing, depending on the activity levels in the amygdala. So that's what's happening in that second. Minutes later, minutes before that, it depends mostly on the environment. If you have a gun in a stressful situation, you are actually more likely to perceive others as having guns. And this again goes back to what I was talking about a minute ago, is like perception is not a mirror. We tend to think in retrospect that, well, obviously the person didn't have a gun. Can't you see that? But that wasn't what was happening when it was all happening. And this happens in situations, like it doesn't have to be something as stark or exceptional as having a gun. It can happen in a discussion with your spouse, or cooking dinner, or talking at work, or caring for the land weekend. So in the minutes before, it will depend on the context of, in the minutes before, it depends on the context of your situation, whether you're hungry or stressed will also impact your amygdala. In the hours and days before, it will depend mostly on hormones, specifically testosterone. Testosterone gets a bad rap. We talk about, some people talk about testosterone poisoning. We link testosterone to violence, high levels. It isn't actually true. Testosterone is a strange hormone. It amplifies status behaviors. It was funny, I was listening to a podcast where actually Dr. Sapolsky and Dr. Huberman were talking about this. And there have been studies where if in the group the status behavior is being altruistic, donating or something like that, the people with higher testosterone will actually donate more. Because it depends on what the status behavior is in your context. And so that's why it's sort of important to shape status behaviors. And also hungry and stressed, cortisol, those will all either amplify behaviors that are going through the amygdala or take the dampeners off, take the brakes off the amygdala. In the weeks to months before that instant you pulled the trigger, it depends mostly on neuroplasticity. Our brains are plastic. They have found now up through much older than they had thought before, that your brain is constantly rewiring itself. If you are in a situation filled with stress and trauma, your amygdala is actually going to get bigger. And the neurons will have, no pun intended, more trigger finger. And your frontal cortex, which is associated with reasoning and deliberative thought and self-control, will actually get smaller. It'll atrophy. In the years before, as an adolescent, your frontal cortex does not fully develop until you're 25. So everything going on and that, all the experiences in the environment are actually shaping your frontal cortex. And so that doesn't mean that, because we talked about neuroplasticity, it doesn't mean that things won't change later down the road. And that's part of the hope that Sapolsky has. But it does sort of set partially with what you will have to work with is your experiences in adolescence. So if you have a lot of stressed and stressful experiences, unsafe and those kinds of things, your amygdala will be larger, other things being equal, and your frontal cortex will not be as big. We go back to childhood. When your brain is developing, it's critical because at that point, epigenetics. So up through, I think, at least the 70s, we had this idea that genes were the blueprints, and they're not. It's sort of like it's a little more like choose your own adventure. So you have this portfolio of genes, and depending on your environment, certain genes will get turned on and certain genes will get turned off. So a good example of this then is well, this is not so much in childhood. If in utero, in the womb, if your mother is experiencing stress, you will be exposed to cortisol, stress hormones. Your amygdala will be more excitable. So that's just something you carry with you. And then all those other things we've talked about affect it. And then again, in the fetus in utero, again, as I said, genes don't do anything. So there's an example of, they call it MAO alpha, completely benign. You have this gene, except if you are exposed to child abuse, it will express as antisocial behavior. So all of these forces are affecting, again, to that moment when the trigger was pulled. And then he goes back centuries. So centuries ago, you have your ancestors. If they were pastoralists, there's a high probability most pastoralist cultures on at least Earth have developed systems of honor and warrior classes, retributive justice, clan vendettas. And as pieces of those things are still rocking around hundreds of years later in your culture that you are picking up on, that will be part of what happens in that second. And then he goes back millions of years. You have, of course, the evolution of species. He was specifically talking about humans, and you have primates. You have a spectrum of primates. You have very low level of violence, and you have very high levels of violence. It's probably at least somewhat comforting to know we are in the middle on that spectrum. We are in the middle of that spectrum. We are not the primates with the highest levels of violence. But, part of that is all, but nothing is in and of itself determinable. And this way I see like parts of this in the 12 links of dependent origination, but the understanding of how all of this accumulation of millions of years of evolution to centuries of cultural changes and emphasis, to fetal development, to childhood development and adolescence, to what's happening weeks and months, to hours and days, minutes, and then seconds when you pull the trigger. And Sapolsky uses the example of violence here, I guess maybe because it's topical, but all of this is still in play with altruism. The actual title of this talk, and you can find it, is it's like the best and worst of us. So his example is actually the worst of us, but the best of us is actually all part of this as well. That all of this is part of the story also of our most compassionate, altruistic, and selfless acts. So like last time, I think it might seem like this is a very slightly hopeless story, right? Except it's not, because the things that we do today are the things that are then the causes and effects of what happens a month from now. And so simple things like getting exercise, eating right, so that we're not hungry and tired a month from now in a situation, or even just tomorrow, or even just later today. But also, I think, practice. So meditation, we don't particularly like to talk about meditation as having goals in the Zen tradition. And I think there are good reasons for that. Don't have time for talking about that today. Maybe that will be the next talk in June. But it has effects on cortisol levels, on increasing the corpus callosum, the connection between the two hemispheres, and all kinds of other different effects, which then again become part of the causes and conditions of what happens tomorrow or in the next second. So I ran a little bit over, I'm sorry, but if there are any questions or discussion or comments.
Say something, you can use this and just face the little white light there.
Go away from the light.
So I have a question.
Okay.
Given all that you've shared with us, how do you apply that in your daily practice?
For me, the biggest things, so there's sort of two things. One is, and I sort of brought this up more last time, so maybe this was a two-part talk. Compassion. So compassion for yourself and for others, the things that you're dealing with. I know there's sort of the slogan, I guess, the Facebook meme is, be nice to people because you don't know about their secret battles. But also it's like, well, be nice because there's that moment of somebody being rude to you or whatever it was. There's a huge accumulation of things that went into that. And I think it's what Jan always reminds me, Rushin always reminds me, it's like, it's not personal. And so you yourself are maybe part of that environment, the cause and conditions of that, but it's just really a lot of compassion for yourself and for others in your actions, and part of the causes and conditions is reflecting on what just happened. And, we learn from our mistakes, which is great. And sometimes we don't learn from our mistakes, which is not so great. But I think actually that's the big one. I think it also just shows why maybe meditation broadly conceived is important, because it definitely has effects on neuroplasticity and cortisol and other things.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question or a comment?
Rushin.
I have a few things, of course. One of the things was this week in my news feed, I got an article about 50 cognitive biases. Maybe other people saw this as well. And it's like, you go through about 10 of them and it's like, well, there's no way out of these things. But you go through all of them and there's this sense that it's all about building up this protective kind of personality. And some of them are, I don't know, there's not a single one that didn't apply in some way. But one of the ones that they talk about almost immediately is this, if somebody is like late for work, if it happens to you, you think it's situational. It's causes and conditions, it's situational. But if it happens to somebody else, you tend to blame it on their character, that they're lazy, that they haven't taken things into consideration. And there's some really funny ones. There's one called the Ikea Effect, which is if you build something or make something yourself, you really like it. Isn't this wonderful? I made it.
No matter how crappy it is.
Yeah, which we got into with the, not wanting to delete your code, because I made it.
Right.
And one that my friend always brings up is this. It's got two names of the researchers who came up with it. Is if
Dunning-Kruger effect.
If you're totally ignorant of something, you're even more confident in your opinion about it.
Yeah. Basically, the idea is the less experienced you are in something, less able you're able to evaluate your own competence. So if you're not very good at something, you can't tell.
And there's all kinds of things like you just assume that other people are more affected by media than you are because you're, I don't know, more.
Yeah, there's all kinds. I had thought about talking about those in my next talk, because it does sort of feed into all of this, and it does seem like at least a challenge, if not a lost cause. I think that my first degree was in economics, and I had a teacher. I studied economic history, and he basically said, and I think it's true, it's like religion came out of the fact that humans don't really scale. Like in the hunter-gatherer past, we were in small groups of 30 or so. which were part of larger groups of 300, and they would break off, and you saw those same 30 people, and days were basically the same. Like every day was the same as the day before, modulo the seasons and maybe a few glacier ice ages. But nothing changed. And so all of these things helped. And so, but, you start 10,000 years ago, you have the agricultural revolution, you have the concentration of populations, and all of a sudden we need to figure out a way to get all these people not to just stop killing each other all the time. And so we kind of end up with religion. And I think that is part of the problem, is like most of these cognitive biases work in a distant evolutionary past, but they're kind of maladaptive now.
So I worked at a software startup once, and one of the women who was co-founders said she'd taken an economics class once, and the economics professor said, basically, all you people making A's and B's will end up working for people making C's.
There is
and
that.
The reason is because people making A's and B's are risk averse, and the people making C's, that kind of risk doesn't enter their thinking. They want to do something, so they're more likely to actually create an environment that hiring people who are smarter than they are in some ways. But I also wanted to talk about this recent arrest and conviction and guilty plea of Mr. Ironpipe in Minneapolis of 5 carjackings. People in Minneapolis and across the country are very concerned about carjackings. So the police and the district attorney's office, they were very proud of the fact that they actually got a guy and, arrested a person. But there was another news feed which talked about his background, which was just horrendous. He was a fetal alcohol baby off the Pine Ridge Reservation. He got a 19-year-old girl pregnant when he was 14. He's been involved in crime all his life, and he tipped over a minivan with his wife and child in it with one of the stolen vehicles. He led police on a chase through red lights and traffic that was so dangerous that they wouldn't keep up with it because he just doesn't care anymore. And this is the situation of causes and conditions. To get him in prison is probably better for him than anything he's dealt with on the outside. And it's just a very, very sad story from beginning to end on this. Well, maybe a lot of stories about causes and conditions are sad stories, but I really like the thing about the guy pestering the Buddha about teach me something, because I thought that is the key. That is the whole thing about cognitive biases and all the personality that you're creating when you have these cognitive biases. If you can just let them loose a little bit by just concentrating on the senses, it's just that's the only thing I've ever found that works at all. So.
Yes, Mary.
Thanks for your talk. I went this direction towards the end. I mean, sometimes, you're very, you have a lot of technical skill in sorting out difficult things, and sometimes I get lost a bit when you're explaining something, and mostly because I haven't done a lot of reading on, let's say, the 12 links. I get, some of it, I get the gist. what what Jan was saying, sort of, it segued it into exactly what I was thinking during your talk, and you actually talked about it at the end, and that is trauma, and how superimposed trauma, domestic abuse, war. You think of the people in Ukraine right now, what they're going through. There's so much trauma that our brains are trying to deal with, that we in Western society, I can't comment on all societies, we're barely understanding what that is. And it feels like, to me, in some ways, even though maybe the science is there and the brain science is there, we just can't catch up with the treatment of trauma and what that is for the brain. I feel, it's like, wow. And then that's what hit me, because trauma is so significant. And the memories, living trauma in the present, right? Through memories. I guess that's post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's what I thought of, just this two-sided, this intellectual understanding of all of this intricacies of consciousness and imagination and patterns of the brain and all of that, and what trauma actually does in people's lives. And obviously what Jan was just saying, in this gentleman's life. That's just a comment.
Yeah, I think that's so. First of all, I'm sorry. I being technical is probably
It's fine. It's fine.
I'm a little on the spectrum. Speaking of brains, so but I think that's right. So we have, at least here in the United States, the ostensibly the left and the right, which have been at times tied up in a nature-nurture debate. And we do, I think, too often give credence in turns to too much to one or the other. But given to what you said, and we do, it was like Rushin was talking about, I think we do tend to subscribe more to character than to circumstances sometimes. But also, like, going to what you said, like, I don't think we know good ways to fix these problems yet. And I'm really identifying where the trauma is, where it is in those steps. So I think that means, in a broader context, that we need to work a little bit harder towards preventing it, because we know it has a big impact and we're not quite sure how to fix it. And I'm not sure that oftentimes it is fixable. And that's just awful.
I'd just like to say this is Kyoku. I guess I better show up here, huh? Showing up is important. So one of the places I take the causes and conditions is that makes it important to appreciate every day what I'm contributing to this sea of causes and conditions, because my sort of operational rules say, look, this stuff is all out there with the proper causes and conditions, it arises. So obviously a prevention, or at least a contribution to a better, more peaceful situation where people are able to really bloom, is in the tiny moments of every life and what we are contributing to the whole. So whatever else, whether it fixes, we can use the Buddhist guidelines and the Eightfold Path to help us at least know a good aim for our every moment and a good aim for our intention. And that is something that each one of us has the capability of contributing, even in prison.
Right. And that, but it also makes it be like just weird things you wouldn't even think about is like making sure you eat and you eat good things so that you're not hangry later. Because you don't know what the domino effect of you're losing your temper in 3 hours might be. It seems like it's just that one small situation, but it could lead somebody to cut somebody off in traffic, which then leads to them getting upset and going home and yelling at their spouse, who then I hate it, and then spanks the kid, and then the kid turns out, it doesn't have to, it doesn't always have to end in mass murder, but you could, just most of our life is really just kind of small things, and it's like you said, like we can try and make the small things better by recognizing all of these different influences.
Thank you. All right, we're coming to the usual stopping point. Does anybody have anything else they want to share or contribute? Well, in that case, let me say a few things. First of all, thank you, Jushin, for a informative and stimulating talk. Next Sunday, we're going to have a talk by Reverend Kikon Mike Howard, and you can see the lineup of our speakers on our website, hokyoji.usa, hokyoji.org. And we're working on getting our most recent talks onto the onto the website, but that might be changing to onto YouTube. But either way, available to people, because we can't all listen to all of them. And then I just want to alert you, we have an extremely busy schedule over the next several months, partly from people who are coming here to conduct retreats, and partly because of the offerings that are being offered through us. The first one is coming up on April 28th through May 1, which is a Qigong retreat that's being offered by Alan. What's Alan's last name? I'm blocking. Alan Williams. And then in the first weekend in May, the Reverend Ikea Susan is going to be offering the True Heart Women's Retreat, a much missed retreat. Over the last 2 years, it's been in hiatus. So please share with others if they're looking for something to feed their spirit. June 2nd through 5th and June 17th through 19th, we're going to have 2 offerings of kind of free form meditation retreat. So one offered by Lee Lewis is just sitting. So it doesn't have a lot of ceremony. It's kind of a plain vanilla form of retreat, as is one offered by Bill Tresh the couple weekends after that, including a group that he sits with regularly in Loring Park during the year. And then just a heads up, save the date, August 5th is our family weekend. And we are really looking to bring together, we've got a couple of people that have volunteered to bring music to that weekend. And it's usually a lot of fun. And again, not something we've done. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook, thanks to, among others, Jushin, who helps us do those postings. Please like us on social media because it makes it easier for people to find us. And then help spread the word about Hokyoji. Today, I don't have the link in the chat box, but we always appreciate your support. So please, if you'd like to offer a gift or support, please go to our website and make a donation. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. And let's do our final 4 vows together. Can you do a bell at the beginning of that? So here we go. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Enjoy the sunshine and the weekend and your lives and making the world a better place by your teeny weeny actions. That means have a good lunch.